Taxation without representation is tyranny. It was the slogan of the American Revolution from Great Britain. It was the reason why the Americans wanted to leave everything to do with Britain, because they were the American colonies and they didn't have any members of parliament in London, but they were ruled from London. Is it the same issue today? We're taxed, and do we have representation in our own governments? I'm going to call tyranny. I'm going to call tyranny on this because the taxes are constantly being forced down your throat, and you don't have a say. Fight me on that one. Moving along. If we do have a tyranny, what do you have? You've got an illegitimate government. You learned that in Political Science 101. What is a legitimate government and an illegitimate government? If it's a tyranny, it's illegitimate because it is not. It's government by force, and the people who are being forced are the one who are being governed. And so who's governing you? A tyrant. What's a tyrant? Well, it's somebody who's doing their own thing and they're dragging you along as a slave. So if you've got this issue, you are I went through a number of different ways to respond. In the end, the best answer was, you're in a pickle. You're in a pickle. Some of the other choices are, you are justified in fighting the government that oppresses you or overthrowing it. There are probably some other answers. But no, you're not really going to go with those ones because the tyrant has all of the force. The police force, the military, tax collectors. So, going and it's not a good idea to overthrow a government this way because it's quite likely you yourself are going to either get thrown in jail or shot. So I don't recommend that. What can you really do in this situation known as the pickle? Stuart Wilde, the metaphysical writer that I often talk about, said what you do is you become what he calls a fringe dweller. What is a fringe dweller? Well, you live in a tyranny, and you know that most people are not going to call their government a tyranny. And, in Stuart Wilde's day, he didn't have, online internet groups where you could argue amongst each other. And in the end, that doesn't do any good either. So, basically what Mr. Wilde did was he wrote his feelings down on paper, submitted it to a publisher, and somebody accepted it. Hay House at one point, but maybe somebody before that, and published his musings, the things he jotted down. And then he would hold seminars around the world, different places, and people who liked his information would come and pay to see him. That's how he supported himself, through book sales and these seminar things. So is that a fringe dweller? Not technically because of that. That's really not fringe dwelling whatsoever. That's being kind of the keynote speaker kind of thing. No, it was because when he wasn't doing these, he used to call them gigs. I would go do a gig in Amsterdam, and a certain number of people would pay to see me. That was called a gig. Seminars or gigs. No, what made him a fringe dweller was when he wasn't doing gigs or writing books, he was I think he spent a lot of time alone or with a very small group of people experiencing paranormal things. And his day to day experiencing these paranormal things brought him the information that he jotted down and made books out of. He ran away from London. He had a jean shop where he sold high-end jeans. And he said in one of his books that he got into smuggling because there was some South American country that wouldn't allow his kind of jeans, or the ones he sold, into the country except through paying the customs people enormous tariffs that made the jeans very expensive. So he said at one time they got fast motorboats and they smuggled a whole pile of jeans past the customs people, and then they had somebody on shore who took them off his hands and gave him money. So smuggling was something that Stuart Wilde did. Smuggling jeans. Have you ever heard of anyone smuggling jeans before? But if we go back to the American Revolution, if you wanted to bring products into the American colonies, well, there were a lot of customs fees that had to be paid. And one of the most famous stories was called the Boston Tea Party, where the people in Boston didn't want to pay these enormous taxes. So apparently a whole pile of tea was dumped into the harbor rather than paying the taxes on it. I don't know how many times Mr. Wilde smuggled jeans into that South American country. But it was part of his journey away from being a merchant and then becoming I don't know what it is about a lot of these British men and women, I suppose, but quite a lot of them are known as eccentric. Eccentric. Definitely more than their fair share of eccentrics in Great Britain. If I was going to, recommend an author to you, would I recommend Stuart Wilde to you? For sheer readability, Mr. Wilde is a lot of fun to read. But, the things that he writes, are they going to help you in real life? No. No, he's very eccentric. He's quite often very humorous in his stories and his teachings. But do his stories and teachings really work for me? No. No, they don't work. I don't see anything that he describes. Wonderful, wonderful stories. Wonderful, wonderful, witty things that make you laugh. But in my real life, no. No, none of it works. But I still like it because the stories are worth $1 million. What works for me? Um, Hodgepodge of different things, really. And does it work for me, really? Well, I'm not smuggling jeans into South America. Someone wants to know, am I happier than Mr. Wilde? Well, I never knew him personally, so I can't really say. But I'm going to say probably not. I think he was a bit of a pirate at heart, and he got to play the part of a pirate doing his smuggling gig. And his stories are just amazing stories. Anybody else would say, well, they're fictional stories, but they're really wonderful stories. But if I was going to recommend anything to you, Treasure Island, my friends have decided Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson is the book you should read if you're a boy. Because it's an adventure story with pirates and treasure and stuffed shirts, and you should read that book. And if you're a woman, well, this is the problem I have with Treasure Island is because there's very few women in this book. And I don't know what it's like to be a little girl or a female at all, except one time when I was in drag. I guess if I put drag on, then I could wander around in the public library to see what me, as a woman, would be interested in recommending to you as a good book. But I'm not in drag and I'm not a woman. And I just still think that if you're a female, Treasure Island, well, unless you're like reading stories about men, I just think if I was a woman, I wouldn't want to read it because there's no women in the story. I'd feel like an outsider. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing. I'm not these men in the Treasure Island story, but because I'm a woman, I can look at them and I can criticize them from a woman's point of view. Beverly Cleary, her Ramona books, young adult books, or maybe even tween books, but they were a story about Ramona, and I think it was her sister. I read those when I was a young lad, and they were really good stories. So, if you're a female and you want a good story and you don't want Treasure Island about the men and the boys, Beverly Cleary is the author for you. And if she's too young for you, someone says Pearl S. Buck, The Good Earth, a story about peasants in China. That's your book stories for today. I'm the Moosehead.